Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of and I hope that you all are, of course, staying safe and staying healthy. Today is the latest webinar in our series called The Road to Recovery. This series focuses on leadership lessons and transportation strategies for our post-COVID future. You can tune in every Wednesday to hear and interact with leaders across the transportation space who will share their firsthand knowledge and experiences on the road to recovery. Today, I'm really excited that we have Rob Britton with us. Rob is, I'm sure, very well known to many of you. He is a sought-after speaker all around the world on a range of topics. He has had a long career in aviation and travel and tourism, and in 2009, he stepped down from a long career at American Airlines. Rob was at American in September 2001, initially as part of the team that helped rebuild the airline and indeed the whole industry after the 9/11 attacks. He also helped mitigate many other crises, including strikes and accidents, and frankly can think of nobody better to talk with us today about leadership and transportation in a time of crisis. So for those joining us live, you can submit questions using the questions function on the webinar website at any time. Rob is going to present some slides, then we're going to take some moderated questions and comments at the end. So Rob, thank you so much for joining us, and let me kick it over to you.
Okay, Robert, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be with you all. I have, as often happens, I have probably an hour's worth of material to do in 20 minutes. So we're going to dial through this really quickly. And I'll just begin to offer some thoughts on sort of scaling this current crisis. A colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine from American, who's now the CFO of a pretty big financial services company, said to me in an email a couple of weeks ago that he thought that COVID-19 was 9/11 plus the 2008 recession times 2. And I think that pretty much scales it pretty well. It's an existential crisis. I've, in my career, have always been reluctant to use that phrase, existential crisis, but I am now because it is where we are now with COVID for lots and lots of companies. But it's a crisis that smart organizations can survive if they have the will to do so. And what I'm going to do today is just share with you a little bit of experience from my career in a crisis-prone industry. Robert explained not just after 9/11, but through other kinds of crises, economic and operational and so forth. So I'm going to share with you sort of 5 big lessons, really more about leadership and management than about specific how-tos and what-to-dos. And so lesson number 1 is you're going to have less money. It's just inevitable. Budgets are going to be whacked. If I read the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or whatever, I see companies already retrenching, obviously. And so what this means is that when you're in uncertain times, you're going to need to make some hard choices. And it's likely that many of you, depending on the organization you work for, have never had to make the kinds of hard choices that you will need to make as you go forward. More fundamentally, it's really simply to make decisions. One of the temptations in crisis and immediately after crisis is that we tend to be so distracted that we don't act, and we're going to need to act in going forward. And one of the aspects of making hard choices is to learn to say no to people. And I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but learning to say no to our peers in an organization, to people above us in the food chain, to suppliers and so forth. Now, when we think about managing with less money, it's not the sort of thing where you're just going to say, okay, let's just whack that budget by X%. You really need to do some analysis and research for critical thinking to ask why you're going to take particular decisions. Oftentimes in organizations, there is a temptation to do what I call the equivalent haircut, where you're going to cut everyone's budget by 20%. That may not make sense. And you may want to do some analysis to say, well, maybe we should leave the marketing budget as it is because we're going to need to do marketing to get our revenues back, whatever it is. Now, when we think about managing with less money, a couple of common analytical pitfalls. One of them we deal with all the time if we're conscious of where we are as an organization, and that is overanalysis. So-called, as we sometimes call it, analysis paralysis. And by that, we mean, you're given a business problem. In this case, what are you going to do with your budget to meet a budget's 40% smaller? And so, you go do the analysis and you get 75% of the answer quickly, but you want 100% of the answer, and the incremental 25% takes you weeks. And so you cannot do that. So I don't mean to be hasty. I don't mean to also overanalyze. And secondly, another pitfall is what I call the cost benefit trap. In crisis, you're going to make hard decisions. And a lot of times you're going to make those decisions on sort of cost benefit analysis. And you've all been through that drill. You take out a piece of paper, you draw a vertical line down the middle of it, you put a plus on one column and a minus on the other, and you fill the column that says, here's all the good things about taking this action. And over on the other side, the bad things, there's nothing there. And very often there's nothing there because sometimes you cannot easily measure some of those things. But my cautionary tale is, just because you cannot easily measure something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You can say, okay, I'm going to reduce our budget by X% by simplifying our product, and it's going to save us $4 million a year. But what revenue are you going to forego by the fact that some customers are going to leave you because you've cheapened the product? And the last point here about managing with less money is to always measure the results. You take a decision and then you move on. That's the temptation. The temptation is to move on. But my recommendation here is to do the post audit, to stop and even spend an hour a week later, 2 weeks later, 2 months later, 6 months later, saying, what happened? Was the decision the right thing to do? So always measuring results is really, really smart. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is how to lead with fewer people. And inevitably, and we're already seeing this in lots and lots of organizations, both public and private, there's going to be smaller staffs. And so one of the things you need to do as a leader is to be visible and communicate more and not less. Hold staff meetings more frequently, because those people that are remaining in the organization are going to be worried and stressed, and they're going to need to know more about what's going on than less. Secondly, it's an opportunity to attack hierarchy. Hierarchy has a way of creeping into all kinds of organizations. And so oftentimes in these crisis and post-crisis situations, it's a good opportunity to attack those hierarchies, to see if you cannot simplify the organization chart, get rid of some layers of management or supervision if they exist. Thirdly, to manage down expectations of work output. In the old days, that is pre-crisis, people were accustomed to getting a study, to getting a plan, to getting whatever quickly, because you had the staff and the headcount to do that, and now you don't. And so what you need to do is to say to peers, to other people in your organization, to executives above you, that because you have fewer people, you're not going to be able to get the work done as quickly as you once could. And it seems real obvious, but unless and until you communicate that, they're going to expect that you're going to continue to perform as you did before the crisis happened. Fourthly, to create and maintain trust. Now, building trust is something that every organization should do all the time, but especially in a crisis and post-crisis mode, to drive accountability and ownership, to develop staff, and to especially to improve productivity. You're going to have fewer people, and you're not going to have the opportunity to micromanage. You're not going to be able to look over their shoulders. You're going to have to trust people a lot more than you did before. Fourthly, to terminate humanely. If there are going to be furloughs in the organization, if there was going to be permanent layoffs or temporary furloughs, you're going to need to know how to deal with those things in a humane fashion. In my 30 plus years in the airline business, I went through a lot of ups and downs and a lot of layoffs. And unhappily, I got pretty good at terminating people in a humane way. It's never easy. It's a sign of failure. I was always upfront with people, but you need to explain to them why it is that they're being terminated, presumably not for political reasons or because they were unpopular, but because their work output was not comparable to those of others in the organization. Next point down, a nice reminder of Parkinson's law. Many of you may know Parkinson's law, which simply says that the job expands to fill available time. True always, and especially true in a crisis environment. And when I talk about time being flexible, what I mean here is that we're going to have a lot to do in a crisis and post-crisis environment. And we're going to be so focused on doing that we don't ever set aside time for thinking. And as leaders and managers, we need to do both. And so unless and until we find some way in a disciplined fashion to set aside time to think, we're not going to ever have time to think and therefore to improve the organization going forward. Next point down, paying attention to colleagues' whole sense of being. People are stressed when they're in a crisis situation. And so as a leader and a manager, you need to walk around and pay attention to people's cues, pay attention to their emotional state, their moral state, their physical state, and paying attention to those things and encouraging people to deal with those things, either through counseling or other kinds of methodology. And as part of this, really thinking hard about work-life balance. And again, in a crisis and post-crisis environment, you're going to have too much to do. And your temptation is to stay at work for longer and longer and longer. And that's just a mistake, because if I've learned anything from a long career, it is that number of hours does not equal achievement and genuine productivity. And so encouraging your teams and encouraging yourself to leave at a reasonable hour, to go home and ride a bike, to work in the garden, to practice your guitar, to encourage your colleagues to do those things is really, really useful. And I think many of you will know that whether you're weeding the garden or running on the treadmill, you have good ideas about work in those situations as well. Now, at some point when crisis abates, or if you find that budgets have been restored and you have the opportunity to hire, just a simple point here, to hire carefully, a huge opportunity and not a burden. Again, something that we need to pay attention to whether we're in crisis or not, but especially in a post-crisis environment, when we have an opportunity to rebuild the organization, to really think carefully about the human resources that you need going forward. Insight number 3, lesson number 3, is to keep innovating. It's no time in a crisis and immediately after a crisis for business as usual. What it is time for is to make bold decisions. And one of the things that we should think about in terms of making bold decisions is to do what I call simplifying the enterprise or simplifying the organization, moving back down what we could think of as the complexity curve. As organizations grow, whether they're public organizations like a transit system or a private company like a ship line, as enterprises grow, they become more complex. They add geographical territory, they add new products, and they add those products, or they expand those markets because there's revenue to justify it. But in a crisis and post-crisis mode, when the revenue goes away, then it's time to bring the costs under control and to think about how you can simplify the enterprise, moving down the complexity curve. I'll give you some simple examples. When we were at American Airlines in deep crisis in the early 2000s, not just because of 9/11, but because we were under competitive siege from the low-cost carriers like JetBlue and Southwest that had much lower costs, we needed to rethink the business. And we were in crisis, but we knew we needed to innovate. And so we made lots and lots of fundamental changes. And I'll share just 3 examples with you very quickly. One of them was reducing aircraft types from 13 different aircraft types in our fleet to 6. And in doing so, saving tens of millions of dollars, mainly on pilot and cabin crew training. Completely transparent to our employees and to our customers, and we could continue to operate the network with a much simplified fleet. Secondly, removing intermediaries from the selling process. This was something that began before 9/11, But as we stepped into crisis post 9/11 and into the other drivers of crisis, we knew that we needed to start to encourage direct selling through our website, saving a lot of money in, for example, travel agent commissions. And thirdly, to create a new model for services and unbundling the product. And the period 2002, 2003, 2004, post 9/11, and in the midst of this competition between the older companies and the newer ones, when we knew we needed to lower our cost structure, this is when the older companies began to unbundle the product, something we take for granted today, charging for a checked bag or a reserved seat. So all of those bold decisions to make fundamental changes, to move down the complexity curve, and to save a lot of money. Insight number 4, resolving conflict. It's going to get ugly. Difficult times breed conflict. And conflict is inevitable in any organization, but especially in those organizations that have what we could think of as strong functional traditions. You know what I'm talking about, where the organization is deeply siloed. The operational silo, the marketing silo, the finance silo, the administrative silo. People aren't talking to each other across the organization. And when budgets get cut and people get laid off, the fighting begins. So it's competition for resources. It's especially keen during times of crisis. And some of the conflict becomes truly tribal. And so the key here is to learn how to resolve conflict without hurting or alienating others. It's actually fundamentally recognizing that there's conflict and being willing to deal with it. Once you recognize the conflict, whether it's across the organization or just within your department, you need to deal with it. Denial is not an option. And there's a couple of ways to deal with conflict in an organization. One of them is to bring in people to train people in mediation and conflict resolution. Another option might be simply to bring in some consultants who can act as mediators. But dealing with conflict is really going to be essential in a crisis environment. And the last lesson, before I wrap up with a couple of concluding remarks, is that character and values matter. Especially, they matter all the time, but especially during challenging time. Organizations and their leadership need a moral compass that points towards honesty and integrity, towards gratitude and courage. And when I say courage, especially the absence of fear. And I think fear is one of those things that every organization is going to need to deal with post-COVID and deal with in their own particular ways. Respect for differences of all kinds, really fundamentally just the golden rule. And that is so essential in any moment, but particularly in crisis moments. Now, to wrap up, and before we open it up to questions, let me simply say that as difficult and painful as things are, and depending on the nature of your organization, things are likely to be for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, positive things come from crisis. One of them, and I know this, believe me, from a long career in a crisis-prone industry, that inner strength comes from crisis and self-discovery. The notion that collectively we can do this, those 4 simple words are so powerful. And when you get through to the other side, if you've never dealt with crisis before, you will understand what I'm talking about. Secondly, team cohesion. As long as you've mitigated the conflict that might exist within your teams, you will come out of the crisis at the other side with a much more cohesive and together team. Certainly more disciplined spending. And again, back to my very first years in the airline business, when I was dealing with my very first existential crisis. I didn't call it that. It was just that we didn't have any money. You will develop a more disciplined approach to spending the money that you have. And things like zero-based budgets, if you've never dealt with them before, they're actually a wonderful and positive thing. Better and faster priority setting. Again, in a crisis mode, as I said earlier, you're going to need to make difficult decisions, and you're going to make them briskly. You're going to do the analysis, but you're going to do it faster than you have done them in the past. And finally, a greater perspective to understand what truly matters to your organization, to your team, and to you as an individual leader and manager. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to stay in touch. I have sent Eno a PDF of these slides, so you can get them from Eno. If for some reason you don't get them, here's my email address, and I'm always happy to be in touch with you. My LinkedIn handle, Rob Britton. I periodically post some cranky posts, and I'd be happy to be in touch with you that way. And now you're very welcome. Let's throw it open to questions, and Robert will moderate at this point.
That was fantastic, Rob. I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights. When we pulled this together, this is exactly the kind of insights and advice that we were hoping to get from leaders like you. You've obviously seen so much and have great lessons for us. I want to encourage folks to keep putting in questions into that questions function on the webinar website. We already have a bunch coming in right now. But let me start with one, just myself, take prerogative here as a moderator. You got so many great points that I was writing down, but there was one that really stuck out to me because we just talked about it last week, right? So we've been bringing in other leaders in transportation to talk about similar lessons, and there's a lot of consistency. Again, a lot of insights that you just had, but also big themes that I think are very consistent across the board. And I want to just point out the bit about values and character, right? This thing, just for folks, has come up on every one of these webinars we've talked to, how important that is. It's very difficult to define. It's very difficult to understand unless you know what it is, but it has come up literally every single time. And that is the driver of all the things I think that you talked about here. I don't think you could do all of those things, bold decision making, all of it, unless you start from a position of having that kind of character and value. Can you say just a little bit more about how important that is?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Robert. There's no question that, I mean, in any organization, in an ideal world, every organization would be imbued, every leader, everyone from the front line to the C-level executives would be imbued with a sense of moral character, with a sense of values and ethics that point towards true north. There would really, as I said on that slide, just really simply understand the golden rule that we would treat others the way that we would wish to be treated. But I think especially in crisis situations, that idea of being able to use the framework of values, of a moral compass, to use that as a framework for deciding how we behave in terms of the decisions that we take about human resources, and the decisions we take about how we deal with suppliers. I mean, just as a simple example, it would be really easy for us to, to say, okay, we're gonna treat suppliers, poorly because, we can, and that's just wrong. And so the idea of having that just so very important. I teach a course in I teach courses in crisis management at Georgetown and a couple of other universities, and give seminars. And and I talk about this, Ian. It's a best practice in crisis management is to have a moral compass. So very important. And Robert, I'm delighted to know that same idea has come across from the other webinar participants, because that's a great thing that needs to be talked about all the time, but especially in crisis situations.
Sure. Yeah, we had Carmen Bianco last week. I guess he headed up the New York City subway, the Ebola crisis, Hurricane Sandy, and he kept coming back to that every time. He said something else too. Just let me add one more question. Was about the I think it was your first slide about prepping for bad decisions, and he was adamant saying that if you're waiting until there's a crisis to start to put some of these things in place, it's too late. So that you have to use the time between crises to put in the mechanisms and the tools that enable you to handle the crisis. And it sounds so simple, but I'm amazed at how over and over and over again we don't do that. We don't take advantage of the easy times to prepare for crises.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're an organization like a transit operating company or others, where you encounter what I call serial crises, right? They recur, they happen again and again. And so Carmen is exactly right. Using those interstitial times when things are calm to focus on preparation to focus on learning from the previous crisis to get your organization in order so that essentially you are crisis ready. Because, when we talk about effective crisis management, being prepared, as I'm sure Carmen was talking about last week, is really one of the best practices.
Yeah, and even though I'm be so impressionistic here, but it actually relates to a couple of comments that are coming in. So so a hurricane, a snowstorm, an accident, maybe some of these things we can prepare for. What we're going through now is, I hate to say unprecedented, it's such an overused term now, but it is. There really isn't a playbook for what we're going through right now. So how do you deal with something like this, which is so rare, I guess, and unique?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I wish I had an answer for that, and certainly a quick one. It's interesting. I've done a couple of these, a couple of presentations on the same theme in the last few weeks, and that question comes up again and again. And you know, other than what we just talked about, in the sense of trying to be crisis ready, even though, as I suggested on that first slide in scaling COVID-19, the magnitude of this is so much greater. But to have a certain mind, I think it's really, in a sense, Robert, maybe the best thing I can say to answer this question, and not very effectively, is to have a sort of a crisis ready mentality, to say, okay, we've just, and I think maybe if COVID-19 will teach us anything, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, looking back, it may be that these kinds of completely out of nowhere crises, we have to think about the fact that they could recur. And whether it's a virus, or it's, a substantial, economic meltdown. I mean, you don't like to even think about those kinds of things on the heels of this disaster, but the sort of crisis readiness mentality, I think all of us going forward, all of us that are dealing with this and are trying to manage our way through, I think are going to be it's going to be on our radar. I mean, we hope not to the magnitude that COVID-19 was, but I hope it's going to be on everybody's radar. And I think, again, I think for the first time, I keep coming back to this idea that I've spent my working life in a crisis-prone business, and I mentioned a minute ago that it's kind of my first economic crisis was my very first years in the airline business in 1984, 85. But for me, it's kind of that crisis readiness, that crisis mentality ended up being woven into me just by virtue of where I worked for a lot of people, and again, I think for a lot of young people, and I'm not saying this to be critical, but just you've never dealt with this before, and now you're in the middle of this just completely awful situation. So I think hopefully going forward, you're going to be sort of, as I said, in the sort of crisis readiness mode.
There's a bunch of questions around aviation specifically. I'm going to hold those for a minute because I want to get to some more of the general ones. A lot of folks are asking, it looks like very specific advice probably to them, but let me try to bundle it together about, I think your very insightful slide about termination, when you have to let people go and things like that. Is there a difference between different levels of individuals of the organization, for executives, senior folks, versus the junior folks that you may have to let go? How do you prep for that, I guess is what they're asking. And then are there differences between those different layers of folks when you have to deal with them?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I'm always a believer that organizations, no matter whether they're public or private, organizations should have a great degree of consistency across all levels of the organization, from the front line to frontline supervisors to middle managers to senior levels, in terms of how decisions are made about letting them go. There shouldn't be a different set for frontline people as for senior executives. It should be based on merit and not on personality, and who is likable and who is not likable, who is abrasive and not abrasive. The issue, although abrasion certainly should factor in, in other words, if somebody is truly toxic, that has to be factored in. But there needs to be, in an organization, a consistent set of principles on how you evaluate merit, how you evaluate performance, how you evaluate, are these people getting the job done? And if those systems exist, as they should in all organizations, they should be applied consistently in this kind of crisis situation where there's going to be retrenchment. And the same criteria should be used, I would argue, the same criteria should be used at the sea level as at the front line. People doing their jobs, how are they doing across a broad range of performance indicators, frankly, including their ability to get along with others. So, I mean, this is, and again, I think this is, you know, depending on the size of the organization, most organizations, public or private, from a mid-size and above, probably have these kinds of practices in place, but maybe they don't. I mean, maybe no one has ever, you know, nobody's ever dealt with a crisis. I mean, many organizations have never dealt with a crisis as deep as this. So now is the time to start thinking about how you do it. And my urging is to do it in as transparent and fair and open a process as possible. I mean, I remember vividly, if I can just tell a quick story, I remember vividly sitting down with my team of about, we had about 35 or 40 people in a big conference room, you know, post 9/11, a few weeks after 9/11, when I became head of the advertising and marketing planning department at American, sitting down with them and just looking everybody in the eye and saying, there's going to be retrenchment, but I promise to you that we are going to do it in a transparent and fair and open way. And if you disagree with anything that comes up, if you've been terminated and you think it's unfair, you're going to need to come see me, because the buck stops with me.
That's a good point. And a couple of related questions are let me try to tie this together. Is about, I think you had a comment about conflict is viral. I think was what it said. Is conflict within an organization, is it worse during crises times? There's a couple of folks who are commenting that they feel like that the conflicts at the organizations are worse now than it is during regular times. Is that true? Or do you have to deal with those things differently?
It is true. It's true in two ways. First of all, there's just the overall, the overall, the overhanging and distracting aspect of the crisis. Even if you're not in a department that's directly charged with managing the crisis, it's hanging over the entire organization. There's a great deal of fear and a great deal of uncertainty. But I think the biggest driver is the fact that, as I suggested on that slide, there's the real driver of conflict is going to be the competition for limited human and financial resources. Your budgets are going to get whacked, your headcount's going to get whacked, and everybody's going to be looking over at each other's shoulders saying, I don't understand why my department is getting whacked more than the other department, this rather than that. And so there needs to be, in that situation, there needs to be transparency, so that you can explain to everyone, why did you take the decision? As I said a moment ago, I said during my presentation, I said, you know, it may not be a smart idea to do what's called the equivalent haircut approach to budget cuts. Everybody's budget gets cut 20%. It may make sense to cut one budget 30% and one budget 10%. But when you do that, you simply have to explain why you're doing that in a way that everybody in the organization can understand. Because if you don't, then people are going to think you're playing favorite, and that's just going to accelerate more and more conflict. So there simply has to be communication and transparency and justification for every decision that's taken.
And that related to the planning as well. If you have the plan in place, if you're prepped and that's all transparent, there shouldn't be any questions when it comes time to make those hard decisions.
Sure.
So a lot of folks are asking, we have a broad audience here at Eno beyond just aviation. I think a lot of folks are tuning in from public transit. I can tell from some of these questions. You have familiarity with public transit, of course. So I think your point about limited resources is a good one. We're obviously experiencing that both in the public and the private sector. Any advice or any thoughts on how different that is between a private organization like an airline and a public organization like a public transit agency?
Well, sure. I mean, there's going to be with a transit agency, and I have some I have some ability to relate both as a inveterate public transit rider, as well as having spent a number of years very early in my career in Minneapolis-St. Paul on the Transportation Advisory Board of the Metropolitan Council, where we dealt with these kinds of things. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of there's probably a greater range if you're a public transit agency, a greater range of stakeholders that need to be dealt with, and people with strong opinions, and elected leaders and politicians everybody yelling at you about this or that, and my favorite route versus that other favorite route, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be hard, and it's an unenviable situation to be in. I would think, if I can speak maybe positively and creatively about managing crisis, if you're a transit agency, I think one of the, back to my last slide, positive things can come from this. I'm hoping, again, as a backer of public transit, I was on the Washington Metro yesterday, round trip to my volunteer gig. As a rider, as a backer, as an advocate for public transit, I'm very much hoping that the COVID crisis, when we come out the other end, that many transit agencies will by that point really start to take some bold decisions about some alternatives to conventional transit routes, to all of the interesting software that's coming out in terms of demand-based transit provision, and so on and so forth. At least to experiment with these things and to try them out and to see if we can't provide mobility in an alternative form, in a form that's more cost-effective compared to the traditional existence of the Washington Metro's 15K bus route. That's my bus to the Metro, which is almost likely to go away post-COVID. So I think again, I think that, the sort of optimism, the fact that the sky is not falling, the fact that we have to approach this, in a disciplined way, but some good things may come out from the other side. But I don't envy any of you that are in the transit world, because it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people, I'm having spent my career in the airline business, I'm pretty familiar with unhappy people, including lots of my next door neighbors when we lost their bags.
Well, let's stick on that piece about the sky falling. And I didn't mean this way, but that obviously you were at the airline after 9/11, which I'm sure felt like everything was different. I mean, within an instant, right, the entire industry changed. Are there any lessons about the transformation of the industry then that we can apply to to potentially what we might see in changes in aviation post-COVID?
Yeah, I mean, look, you have to be very clear about this, and I think the best place to start it is to scale it. Immediately after 9/11, in the autumn of 2001, domestic air travel demand dropped about between 20 and 25%. It was rebuilt entirely within about a year. In the aviation world today in the United States, it's starting to slowly build back. But I mean, we were looking in April and this month at 95% reductions in demand. So the magnitude of drop in demand is much greater. But some of the principles that come out, I think, are the same. And one of the things that I think, in fact, I know airlines are doing, is they're beginning to develop. In fact, they've already got it out there. They're really working on a lot of market research. And one of the transferable lessons from 9/11 is the following, and I think this is transferable to other modes of transport as well. Before you can develop any sort of action plan, any sort of strategy post-COVID, you need to do your market research, your customer research, your public opinion research to really understand what's going on in terms of the drivers of reduced demand. People are afraid. Why are they afraid? What is it that's causing the fear? What do they need to? Some of these things can be ameliorated. Some of the things can't be ameliorated. But step one is to understand those kinds of things. Step two, I think, in any organization is to really think carefully about pricing strategy. Can you use price to build back demand? Some places yes, some places no. Thirdly, I think, and I think this is probably more for people that are in the intercity transportation business than intracity or public transit, but we've really got to be, in terms of reluctance to travel, we've really got to, and I'm putting my marketing hat on now, we've really got to remind people that there's enormous emotional satisfaction that comes from getting together with friends and family and traveling to new places and so on and so forth. And I could probably go on for a while, but I must tell you, the magnitude of rebuilding in the post COVID environment is going to be very great. Just to say one more thing about aviation. I've been around the business for a long time, and I've been emailing and Zooming and talking with a lot of people in the business. I've come to the view after 2.5 months or so, I've come to the view that the airline industry worldwide is not going to be able to rebuild and really consider itself, if you will, back to normal until there's a vaccine. I simply don't think that there will be enough confidence in traveling until and unless there's a vaccine. I'm optimistic that's going to happen quicker rather than later. But I think we're gonna need that in order to completely rebuild, and that may be the case for other modes of transport as well, because the fear factor, I think, is going to be something that all of us are going to have to really understand. And as we rebuild, dealing with that fear factor, first of all, to understand from a customer research standpoint how big it is and what the nature of it is, and whether there are things we can do to ameliorate, and then in a proactive fashion to go forward and start to make people feel better and to help them assess the risk. Because once we start to get below these magic numbers, and the crisis, the virus contagion begins to abate, there's still going to be people that are going to be just way too afraid. And we're going to have to hold their hand and say, look, you need to understand the risk is how small, and we're going to need to help them understand that in ways that they can appreciate, because it's not going to be a rational process. But if we can present some rational numbers to them for reasons why they should get on a bus or a subway or a commuter train or an airplane, that's going to be a good thing, going to be necessary.
That's really good advice. The one question, well, let me save that one for a second. So as it relates to aviation, are there changes that you think are permanent? There was a Senate hearing, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, and one of the witnesses commented that when you get back to an airport, it's going to look very different. The flying experience for Americans is going to be very different going forward. Do you think that's true? Can you say any more about how you think it might change? Has the business changed?
Well, I think, yes, a couple of things. I'm going to say just 2 things in the interest of time. I think thing one is I agree with that statement up to the point where everyone's been vaccinated. And when everyone's been vaccinated, in fact, this is not just true for aviation, but for the society and culture in the world in general. Once that happens, I think the experience is going to be the same, because there's not going to be any need. There's going to be no need, irrational fear about contagion or anything else like that. It's going to be no different from seasonal influenza. But the business, I think demand is going to change. Possibly permanent. Well, not possibly. Demand is going to change permanently. The degree of change needs to be understood and scaled. But one of the things that's happened, and we're living that right now in real time, this very moment, we're all connected to each other via video conferencing and technology. And if I know anything, I've known that over the past 2.5 months, people have been accustomed to this. And it's, in many environments, in many respects, it's not the same as being face-to-face, but it's not too bad. And so the business trip that people said we have to take may be substituted with a video conferencing, with teleconferencing, with a great savings to the organization and a great hit to every company that's involved in the business travel that used to happen before, airlines and hotels, car rental companies, and the rest. I can't scale that decline in demand, which is on the business travel side, but it's going to be real. I just know it will. People have been talking about this. I remember I took a course as an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota almost 50 years ago, where the professor was talking about the substitutability of telecoms for transportation. 50 years ago, we kind of rolled our eyes. Nowadays, it's real.
Yeah, it's good advice. Let me just finish with one more. I want to squeeze this one in. It came while we were talking about aviation, but I thought it was a good question. I want to make sure we address it. And it relates to your point about decision making in a time of crisis. the questioner is asking about biases. Is it possible to control your internal biases at a time during crisis when you're making decisions? And we see this a lot now with folks, I think, using what's going on now as a way to justify things that they were talking about before. You talk about data-driven decision making and things like that, but how do you avoid biases when you're making decisions at a time of severe crisis like this one?
Yeah, I think that, again, in the interest of time, a crisp answer. What you need in an environment like this is you need robust group discussions. You need a whole lot of people sitting around the table debating big issues and debating them in a forthright fashion. One of the very interesting processes that we did at American Airlines post 9/11 in terms of workflow and how we worked together after that crisis was within, and I was in the marketing department at the time, every day at 3 o'clock for weeks and months after 9/11, every day we would go up to a big conference room, and every senior member of the marketing department would talk about what they knew. We would talk about initiatives and big ideas, and we would debate these kinds of things so that internal biases, somebody may come forward, somebody who's the vice president may come forward with an idea and expose that idea to everybody in the organization and have people debate it in a robust fashion, rather than to have internal bias creep in and say, well, we're going to do it my way and we're going to decide this because I can. And so the idea of having consensus-based decision making is a good way to mitigate against those kinds of internal biases where I say, I know the answer and we're going to go forward and you're going to listen to what I say because I'm in charge.
Boy, I can see personally how that's very important, especially these days when there's so much coming at you. You've got to make decisions quickly, and you already know what's going on because you're an expert. But things are different now for sure. That's great advice. We're just about out of time. I want to just then thank you all so much for the participation, and thank you, Rob, for your insights. So many. We covered a lot of ground. So many good points on planning, communications, crisis readiness, transparency, and a bunch of folks even commented that they really appreciated using the term moral compass. And that's something that we forget about a lot in this business, but it's good to keep that in mind. So again, thank you all very much. As I mentioned, this Road to Recovery webinar series takes place every Wednesday at this time. Next Wednesday, we will be joined by Jennifer Almut. She heads up the development and operations of major toll roads in North America on behalf of Transurban. She'll be talking to us about that. We have lots of other great webinars coming up. We have one tomorrow, May 28th, on our new report on congestion pricing. Rob talked about pricing strategies. This fits right into that. You can check out our website for more information about all of our work, all of our webinars at www.enotrans.org. While you're there, you should check out and subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly. It's an invaluable resource on all things transportation, edited by Jeff Davis, who I think is known to many. So again, my thanks to you, Rob Britton, for your participation. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe.